From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters.
Liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis on a mission to build, resupply, and to do research on the International Space Station.
Way up there, way up there, above the clouds and into space, into an endless void.
Discovery Houston, 20 seconds to LOS TDRS.
Roger, nice to be in orbit.
It's so far out of the confines of the Earth's atmosphere, it's enough to make you forget. There are exactly 7 human beings who are not living on a pandemic-stricken planet. They're astronauts from all over the world living on the International Space Station. The lessons they're learning up in space, the technology they're working on, might be our salvation back here on Earth. Space experts say that the technology that's been developed and tested in space is already a fixture in our daily lives. Things like camera phones and satellite mapping technology. They point to the cardiac monitors being used to help COVID patients in the ICU. That was first used to track the health of astronauts. One of those experts is Canadian astronaut Dave Williams. And Dave knows a thing or two about both medicine and space exploration. He began his career as an ER doctor in Toronto and later ran a hospital in Newmarket. His work in between that was out of this world. Dave served as an astronaut on 2 space missions, logging over 680 hours in space and performed 3 spacewalks on the ISS, a record for the most spacewalks by a Canadian astronaut. He later became the director of the Space and Life Sciences Directorate at NASA. Later on in the episode, we're also joined by our star colleague, Alex Boyd, to talk more about space technology in the pandemic. But first, we're talking to Dave Williams to talk about looking up towards the stars to figure out how we can solve parts of the pandemic. Dave, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for your time.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm really excited to share some of the stories from flying in space and what some of that new technology can do for us.
You know, your perspective on the pandemic is so unique because you're looking at this as a healthcare professional, but of course, you're also an astronaut, someone with a deep understanding about space and all the technology that encompasses. How do you think those two disciplines and industries of space and medicine, how do they cross over in this moment of the pandemic, you think?
Well, for many years, arguably, the space program has been driving the development of new innovative technologies that we can use to enhance remote medical care in communities in isolated parts of the world, and also just drive the development of new technologies that we use in hospitals. A great example of that would be surgical robotics. But for the pandemic, imagine when you're in space and you have this amazing view of our planet orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes, you realize there's no borders separating countries that you can see. We're clearly all in this together in what we might call a global village. And the pandemic really reminded us of that. What happens in one part of the world affects us throughout the whole world. And we can use spaceborne technology to help understand the spread of disease on Earth.
And how do you think we can do that? Because, as you were saying, we're interconnected. You've seen that on the most macro of levels, but how did that remind you of how we can work together right now?
Well, I think, first of all, the perspective of space is one that we might call planetary stewardship. It's realizing we're all in this together. The solutions are complex. We have to work together collaboratively to find solutions to global challenges. And the pandemic's a great illustration of that. In fact, in the early days of the pandemic, we were trying to figure out where it was spreading to. We were using new technologies, geographic information systems, geospatial technologies to plot where the pandemic was spreading. But more importantly, understanding what was happening came from the result of doctors all over the world collaborating together, sharing their clinical experiences. The development of the vaccines, again, underscored global collaboration with researchers working around the world to be able to develop the information needed to produce these vaccines. So the pandemic underscores what we've learned in space. Global collaboration helps solve complex problems.
So that technology right now, it's easy to look at it and say, well, what might we do in 10, 15 years, maybe the next pandemic? But what you're saying then is that that technology that we developed for space or in space, it's being used right now in the pandemic to help us figure out how to solve this problem?
It is. And a great example of that would be using remote sensing, Earth observation technologies to monitor the spread of disease. That sounds like science fiction, but in fact, it's really science fact. And what we're able to do is monitor the spread of water, for instance. That's an easy example. Where water goes, disease tends to go as well because we get waterborne illnesses. It could be caused by bacteria, they could be caused by parasites, it could be caused by viruses. So we can monitor the spread of water from space and predict where disease will begin to emerge as that water spreads. And with global climate change, this is a really important technology, not only to be able to monitor the health of our planet, but to monitor the spread of disease on Earth.
So how do we try to prevent the next pandemic or know what to do in the next one? Because, we all hope this is the last one we see in our lifetimes, but pandemics have happened throughout human history. They will happen again. What kinds of technologies are being developed right now for the future, you think?
Well, to your point, pandemics unfortunately will happen again. I think this is the fifth or sixth pandemic that's taken place in my clinical career as a doctor. So these things do recur. One of the opportunities that we have is to learn how to respond to future pandemics based on the lessons of the past and to make sure that we embrace those lessons, that we try and increase our preparedness. But to talk specifically to your question, artificial intelligence technology is really transforming healthcare. And there's two primary technologies that are drivers in space that will also drive changes in healthcare and public health on Earth: artificial intelligence and augmented reality. And I think in the case of public health and monitoring the spread of disease, predicting where disease might spread, artificial intelligence systems combined with geographic information systems will give us the technology to help monitor and control the spread of disease.
Dave, you wear a lot of hats, but one of them, I would imagine, has to be as an educator too, right? I mean, for people who perhaps don't see the value or maybe tangible benefits of the study of space or of the funding of space programs, how do you explain to them the return that work gives us?
I think partly we need to do a better job communicating the message about what we're doing in space, why it's so important, how going to space helps us further understand the human condition here on Earth, whether it's remote sensing capability, monitoring the environmental change, monitoring weather patterns, or monitoring the spread of disease. All of those technologies help us here on Earth, notwithstanding the fact that to go farther in space requires new technologies to help us live and survive that we can then use on Earth. And I'm currently CEO of a company called Leap Biosystems. We're developing augmented reality technologies to help people deliver healthcare everywhere, whether that's in space or in remote communities on Earth.
When in your training, I wonder, did you realize that the lessons that we're learning up there can help us back here on Earth?
It's interesting, as a physician astronaut, you're exposed to a wide range of training, but part of that is how to be a doctor in space and care for other individuals. And learning about that experience of being a doctor in space and caring for other individuals and talking about the technology we need helped me understand how these technologies can help us here on Earth. And there's this relationship between space and terrestrial technology where we innovate on Earth to be able to go farther in space. We take those technologies from space, we implement them on Earth, and we make it better so that the cycle continues. And that's one of the really exciting things. Who would have ever imagined 30, 40 years ago doing robotic surgery? And yet that's a direct spin-off of space robotic technology. And robots can do things that humans might not be able to do. Precision-based tasks, neurosurgical procedures, complex orthopedic procedures in the spine can all be done using robots and help eliminate some of the challenges that human surgeons might have faced in the past. So it's a really exciting time, but we have to share the story. This is such an amazing story where the space program converts science fiction into science fact.
You're talking about that communication piece of how to reach people maybe where they're at. And, I see a lot of the headlines these days in news about space travel that involve billionaires. And we, hear and see these images of people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos launching their own spacecraft and funding through their own private programs. But I wonder, is there a different way to look at this where the technology of space travel can feel more accessible to regular people and how it fits in their lives?
I think there's tremendous opportunity. And while we focus on the billionaires that are flying right now, metaphorically, spaceflight commercially is where commercial aviation was 100 years ago. It was expensive, it's risky, it was only for a few people. But I think we're going to see more and more of these private astronauts doing research in space, doing what we did as professional astronauts on the space shuttle and on board the International Space Station. But more importantly, right now we're focused on recovering from this pandemic. It's been a tragedy. Really, there's no words to describe how we've had to weather this storm, and we've all weathered it in different boats. Some people, it's been relatively not a big deal, but other people, it's been a huge challenge and they've lost loved ones and it's been a tragedy. Recovering from this is about economic growth and opportunity. And the global space economy right now is around $350 billion a year. This is going to be growing over the next 20 years to 1.1 trillion. This is new jobs, new companies, new opportunities. And I would love to see the Canadian portion grow to be 10% of the global space economy.
Right. So you're saying not just the green economy, but the space economy is growing.
Absolutely, no question. And the two are interrelated. When you think about greening technologies, think about the sustainability of the International Space Station. 100% of the electricity comes from solar power. The heating of the space station is provided by all the electronics that's used on board the International Space Station. In fact, we have to actively cool the space station, somewhat like geothermal cooling here on Earth. So if we were to emulate the closed loop habitability systems, basically how we live in space, and do that the same way on Earth, it's a great opportunity in a greening economy.
It's fascinating that you also talk about how where we're at right now with space travel and comparing that to the aviation industry. Do you think we are beginning to see the early start of public-private partnerships for space agencies and space travel? Are we headed into that direction over the next, 20, 30 years?
I think the public-private partnerships are really exciting, and they're going to take us in directions that it's really hard to forecast today. I personally believe the human species is a spacefaring species. And that sounds like science fiction. But again, if you go back to the 1960s and you think about technology then and what we were doing, sending humans to the moon and bringing them back, and now looking at the technology we have today, in the palm of your hand in your smartphone, you've got more computing power than they had on the Apollo lunar landing module. Technology is changing the world. Science fiction that we saw in movies in the 60s is now becoming science fact. And that is going to be a really exciting time watching as we go forward and do this, developing the new technologies to enhance space exploration that we can use on Earth. But more importantly, developing the sense of caring for planets, caring for our own planet and other planets that we may be exploring.
I've heard you speak in an interview before about the ISS as this beautiful example of how human beings across borders, different languages, cultures can work together in the most demanding, obviously, of locations and set of circumstances. What did being up there in space for you? What did that teach you about A, how we can work together, but B, also how we can fix some of the challenges down here, you think?
What it showed me was the power of relationships. And I've been so lucky in my career to be able to work in space on board the International Space Station with people from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds, different scientific backgrounds, speaking different languages, and one-on-one. It's an amazing experience building the relationships and working together and overcoming sometimes the differences and the challenges to achieve greater goals. And also as an emergency physician, I've done the same thing. I've had patients who've come from all over the world who speak different languages and have different cultures, and being able to help those individuals and their families in their time of need has taught me that one-on-one and in small groups, we can work together collaboratively no matter where we're from in the world. Our bigger challenge is how we work together in larger groups in different nations with different economic goals and things. But I think the metaphor of the space station holds true no matter what the size is. Working together collaboratively may not be easy, but we'll find much better sustainable solutions.
Dave, it's a real joy and an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
And that's Canadian astronaut Dave Williams. Coming up, we're talking to our colleague, Alex Boyd, Toronto Star reporter in Calgary, who reported on what technology is already being developed right now to help track the next pandemic before it even begins. We'll be right back. Alex, great to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You've spent a good chunk of the past 19, 20 months reporting on a wide gamut of stories about the pandemic. You've covered vaccination, the politics of vaccination mandates, restrictions, all of that. So, how did the idea of space technology get on your journalistic radar?
You know what, Adrian? I'm going to come clean. This was not something I was aware was a thing until this new piece came out in Nature Medicine, making this point that there are a lot of commonalities between space technology and the technology we use here on Earth for healthcare. And you're right. I've written so much about healthcare and technology and how we think about the pandemic, how we track viruses this year. And to be honest, I felt a little caught out that I hadn't heard of this before. So that to me, I thought was just really interesting that this is the argument essentially that they're trying to make, that space technology is all around us. It could be used for healthcare. And as we, enter arguably kind of a new age of paying attention to space travel and think again about what we want from our journeys into space, that the fact that this could have benefits potentially for us, stuck here on Earth is something that they want people to be thinking about.
Looking back at space technology, it's not actually really a fanciful or a far-fetched idea, though, is it? That we can use that technology to tackle medical and healthcare issues here. Can you explain how that's already reality? We're already doing it.
Yeah, I've heard this from a few people who work in space technology, always with kind of this slight vibe of frustration that people don't quite get how much space technology is already around us. So, things like the little camera in your smartphone that most of us use pretty regularly, that sort of stuff, has its roots in the tiny little cameras that were developed for use in space. There are certain tires that have their roots in companies that were building tires for the space station. There's certain medical technologies, for example, that involve monitoring patients really closely. Again, versions of those were initially designed for use in space and monitoring astronauts from afar. So there is space technology in our lives already. And arguably, at least this is what the authors of this study are arguing, is that there are some of these technologies that could be used for tracking things like viruses. The pandemic obviously has changed how we think about a lot of things. And so they're trying to make that point that, if we're going to be dealing with pandemics going forward, tap space in, bring some of that technology to be used.
And one of these authors, Dr. Farhan Asrar, who you spoke to, he is an assistant professor of community medicine at U of T and a global faculty member at the International Space University. He talks about this idea of teleepidemiology. Sounds, again, far-fetched, but closer to reality than we think. Can you explain what that is?
Yes. I think this is such an interesting idea. So, it's the ultimate big picture if you want to learn about a disease, is using satellites to actually try to track how they're moving. And so, at risk of stating the obvious, you can't see a virus from space, but you can see some of the ways that viruses travel. So, for example, if they move within animals, if they move within water, these are the sorts of things that you can see from space and then start to try to map and try to figure out how that virus might be moving. The other thing that has been used before, for example, during the Ebola, or one of the past Ebola epidemics, we've had a couple, but the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has spoken about this. But when they're trying to plan vaccination campaigns, for example, it can be really difficult to figure out where those vaccines need to go, because in some countries, not every single village or every single community is necessarily on the map. So they've been able to use satellites to actually figure out where those vaccines need to go, where people are that might be at risk of exposure to that virus. So it's kind of getting a bird's eye view, if you will, of where the virus is going and where medicine needs to go.
There are many listeners who might not fully get the value of space exploration and especially why we should be paying for it. I think that has been a challenge since the earliest days of aerospace and space agencies of, why do we need to look up there? And I wonder if your own perspective in this moment of the pandemic, did it change when you spoke to Dave Williams about this and how he spoke about how space technology can be used?
That is a huge criticism of space. It has been since the 60s of why are we spending so much money to go to space? I think it's an important thing to consider, or it's an important piece of the puzzle here, that it's not just about travel. It's not just about sending astronauts up to space because it's cool. But, there is an argument that doing this sort of exploration develops technology, pushes technology forward in a way that ultimately can benefit us. Of course, you do have to make sure that it does benefit all of us and that we are getting, value for this investment. But I think it's part of the equation as we think about space. Obviously then people are going to have opinions on whether or not that makes sense to still use money in that way. But I do think it's just a piece of it that maybe is worthy of consideration. Alex, excellent reporting as always. Great to talk to you. Thanks for having me. And that's Toronto Star reporter Alex Boyd, based in Calgary. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Pattinen. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattinen. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.